Where have all the columns gone? Reviewing the previous video, it occurs to me that we talk about TR elements for rows and TH and TD elements for cells, but we don't define columns. Well, you've probably figured this out already, but I wanted to make the point explicitly. There are no elements for creating columns. Columns are defined implicitly. The collection of all the first cells in all the rows creates a column in the table. The collection of all second cells in all the rows creates a column in the table, and so on. Whenever you add a cell, TH or TD element to a row, you should add a similar cell in the same position to all rows to create a column. However, sometimes reality is not always so orderly, and we'll find some alternatives in this lesson. Grouping by rows. The purpose of a table is to present data in an easy-to-grasp format so the viewer can understand data intuitively. And here we have a different inventory table from before. Notice we have column labels, item ID, item description, packaging unit, unit price, quantity in hand, and quantity on order. Now, if we want to help the viewer a bit more, we might want to group related rows together. In particular, notice the item ID column gives us a clue. Items with the first two letters of item ID being the same are somehow related. So we could group rows along that line. But it doesn't help just to group the rows. You really need to label each group so the meaning of the grouping is clear, and that will require another column. So it works this way. Our current version of the table code looks like this: table with a caption, and then a row which contains the column headers, and then rows of data. And each row of data has an item ID, item description, packaging, unit, and the three numeric fields we talked about. We want to add now a new heading for the new column, maybe category. So we put that in the first row. For the data rows, consider that the first grouping will be all the items whose item ID starts with FS, and there are 10 rows that meet that criteria. So we'll add a new TD element in our first row. TD, row span equals 10, foodstuffs, NTD. Here we introduce the new attribute row span. Clearly, this tells the browser that this TD element will span 10 rows. This also means that you don't have to add a TD value for the next 9 rows. The row span implicitly adds space for this column. Then further down, we'll add these TD elements: TD row span equals 3 clothing, and TD row span equals 3 appliances, and TD row span equals 8 software. And now we see our table looks like this. So we see the new column header and the new column titles. Well, it sort of shows the idea, but visually it doesn't grab me. What we need to do is add some style. So I created this entry in my style element. Side title, border top none, border right solid black 2 pixels, border bottom solid black 2 pixels, border left solid red 2 pixels, font weight bold, text align left, padding right 5 pixels. And as usual, I created this doing some trial and error. And then I added class equals side title in each of the new TD elements start tag, like this. And now the result looks like this, which I think has a very clear presentation. Note, when you have row span equals specified, any content is, by default, set up to be vertically centered in the cell. It makes sense that if you are grouping by rows, all rows need to belong to some group. Note that groups of rows can, in turn, be grouped at a higher level. row groups cannot overlap. Grouping by columns. As with rows, there may be times when grouping cells by columns may help the viewer grasp the data more intuitively. The process is analogous. You'll add a row at the top of the table containing TH or TD cells that have the col_span equals attribute. Here's an example based on a table in the Wall Street Journal. The result I'm looking for is this. Notice the caption and the body, 8 columns, and the 2 levels of headers. The top headers are over the right 6 most columns. So here's the code to produce that result. We have our table and a caption, and now here is our row of headers. And notice the first TH is a col_span 2, and the next TH is a col_span 3 with latest session, and the next TH is col_span 3 with 52 week. And then our row of labels for the next level of headers: company, symbol, close, net change, percent change, high, low, percent change, and then the actual data rows. The col_span attribute tells the browser how many columns each TH or TD can span. Now, there are 2 additional elements to discuss here: col and col group. They can be used to specify a background color and or border properties for all cells in a column or span of columns. Let's start with the col element. The syntax is start tag col, possibly span equals and possibly style equals attributes. And the style can either specify a border and or a background color. No end tag is allowed. There is no content. And the value for span is 1 to 1,000. The default is 1. You may specify a style attribute that specifies a background color and or one that specifies border properties. The border properties are only supported for tables with style equals border collapse. No other style properties have any influence here. Note that using class equals does not work for col elements. You need to account for all columns up to the last that you are spanning. That is, some number of col and col_span equals. You should have all columns accounted for. Col elements must come after any caption and before any row elements, TR elements. Here's an example. In our previous example, we'll modify this a little bit. After the caption, we'll have col span equals 2, col span equals 3, style equals background color lime, and col span equals 3, style equals background color pink. And the rest is the same. And it looks like this. So you can see how the background color influences the result. So what the col element brings to the table is saving having to code class equals in each TH and TD cell in the column. That's not much if you don't intend to specify a background color or border for those elements. You see, at first, I thought the col element would be how you define columns, but I was wrong. A second related element is col group. If all columns, or the first n columns, are to have the same background or border properties, you can specify a start tag of col group, possibly with span, possibly with a style attribute with border and or background color, and that's the start tag. Then you possibly have some content, and then the end tag. An end tag is not required, but recommended. Now, if span equals is present, then you cannot have content for the element. That is, any style properties apply to the first n columns, and that's all there is to say. If span is not specified, then the col group element may have 0 or more col child elements as content. If there's 0, then only one column in the group. Col group elements must appear after any caption and before any TR elements. That is, You can use all col group elements and get the same result as using only col elements. So this code produces the same result as in the previous example. Notice these are all col groups with no content. But the main use of col group would be to specify the default style rule for all columns and then use col elements to override this for one or more spans of columns. Here's an example. I've got a col group with no span, so I can have col child elements. And you see what this says is all columns should have a background color of lime, except column 3 should have a background color of pink. And columns 4 and 5 should have a background color of gold. And column 6 should have a background color of pink. And column 7 should have a background color of light green. The result looks like this. Now, this scenario seems unusual to me, but my students always seem to find uses that I miss. So here's a tool that might be of use someday. So you can group columns by just using the col span attribute in th or td elements, or just using col elements, or just using col group elements, or using both col group and col elements. Using col and or col group only has use if you need to specify background color or border information, and that border information is only if the table is border collapse. Col and or col group elements must come after any caption element and before any tr elements. Basically, you're defining the column groups for the whole table, so the grouping structure must be made clear to the browser up front. The total number of columns specified must match the number of columns implied by the row and cell structure. The limit of 1,000 columns is obviously arbitrary, a number chosen such that it will be well above any actual need. Column groups cannot overlap. Defining cells that span rows and or columns. Within a table, you may have a need to create cells that cover multiple rows or multiple columns or both, regardless of any column or row grouping. I call them large cells. For example, in this inventory table that we've looked at before, we have 2 large cells. We achieve this effect by defining cells using the col span and row span attributes of th and td elements. The strategy to create large cells. Start with the first cell in the block, leftmost and uppermost in the block. If you'll be spanning columns, add col span equals followed by the number of columns. If you'll be spanning rows, add row span equals followed by the number of rows. Then remove th and td cells in this and subsequent rows that are now included in the col span and row span values. In this example, for the previous block we had this, and now we coded this. Notice the second entry with col span equals 3, so that means it's like having 3 td elements accounted for. So the first column cell remains unchanged. The second cell covers 3 cells, so that means we've accounted for the first 4 cells of the row, and we only need to code the last 2. We also defined a style class for this, dot white on blue, background color blue, color white. For the second block, we started in this row with the first cell of FS438 and went to the third cell in that row. And we added col span and row span in that cell. So here we have TD FS438, TD sushi breakfast, and now TD col span equals 4 and row span equals 3, and our class and our text. Then we deleted the following 3 cells in the row and also the last 4 cells because of col span, and each of the next 2 rows because of row span. And we also defined a style class, dot fuchsia, background color fuchsia, color white. Notice the BR element in the text for the large cell. By default, the browser will make cells as wide as the widest cell content in a column. So if we did not have the BR element, the cell would be much wider because the text would be seen as one long line. Cells may not overlap each other. The T-head, T-body, and T-foot elements. These elements allow you to divide your table into distinct parts. Furthermore, when you print your table, the contents of T-head will be repeated at the top of each page, and the contents of T-foot will be printed at the bottom of each page. The syntax in all three cases is a start tag, T-head, T-body, or T-foot, possibly some attributes, and then TR elements, table row elements, and then an end tag. Start tags and end tags are optional in various circumstances, but it's best to always code both to make it absolutely clear. Useful attributes for these elements: ID, class, and style. Possible events to prepare for: none. If a T-head is present, it should follow any caption in col group or col elements, and before any TR elements. If a T-body is present, it should follow any T-head. And if a T-foot is present, it should come at the end of the table, before the end table end tag. You can only have one T-head and one T-foot per table. You can have multiple T-body elements. It is said that some browsers will let you scroll from one T-body to the next, but I'm not aware of any that actually do this. If you don't have a T-body, an implicit one is constructed for you. Example. Working with the inventory table from the previous lesson, I took the header row and enclosed it in a T-head element, also adding class equals B to each element in the heading, and we'll see that in a second. And I put the same thing, except as T-foot, at the end of the table. Now for the class of B, I specified this: td.b, color red, font weight bold, font size 10 point, font family courier, border left none, border top none, border right solid red 1 pixel, border bottom double black 3 pixels, padding left 2 pixels, padding right 4 pixels. Again, this was constructed using trial and error. And I put a few T-body elements with their end tags in the body. Finally, I defined a style class for T-body. T-body, border bottom, double black 3 pixels. Now the result displays this way, which is pretty much what we saw before. Exception, notice the double line border at the end of each table body section. But here we see a functional difference. So here's our inventory list. At the top, there's our header from T-head in the body, and you can see the lines where the T-body differences were. And we scroll all the way down to the end, and there's the T-foot, the same as we had the T-head. Going back to the top, then we go into the File menu and Print Preview. And here we see there's our header, and we scroll down, and there's our footer. And the next page, there's our header again. And at the bottom of the page, our footer. And the next page, our header. And that's the main advantage of T-foot, T-head. In this lesson, we examined ways to structure tables that were a little more complex. Grouping by rows, using row span in TH or TD elements. Grouping by columns, using one of these techniques. Col span in TH or TD elements, or col elements, col group elements, or combinations of these. How to define cells that cross over multiple rows and or columns, and how to use the T-head, T-body, and T-foot elements. Coming up, first is another video in this lesson that walks through developing a complex table. In the next lesson, we discuss scripting for tables using DOM methods and JavaScript. See you there.